you. Thank you, everyone. It's such an honor to be here. It's such a joy. Good morning. This is the earliest I've ever talked. Not just a formal talk, just like talked at all. Actually, that's a lie. It's not very early for me. I have a 2-year-old. He wakes me up every morning at 5 a.m. demanding Elmo. And so it's actually really late for me. But for some of you, I assume some of you don't have a 2-year-old that wakes you up at 5 a.m. demanding Elmo. So I'm very grateful you came out for you. And I want to do my part to make this worth your while. So I've spent the last 20 years obsessing over the question of what's wrong with American public life. Why is everyone so lonely? Why is everyone so isolated? Why have so many people dropped out of American public life? Why is our politics so dysfunctional? Why do people not trust our institutions? And, honestly, why are so many of our institutions not worthy of our trust? And, summarizing it, why are we so hopeless? And why have so many of our attempts at turning around these big problems of our time, the latest technology or the latest politician or the latest social trend have turned out to not be the silver bullets that we thought they would be. And in 20 years of obsessing over these questions, I've gleaned about 2 ideas, only 2. I'm averaging about 1 a decade. And, if I had 30 minutes to talk to you, the last 10 minutes would be blank. But I only have 20 minutes, so I thought, that's a good amount of time to share those 2 insights. And the adventure, mostly, of how I happened upon them. And those 2 insights kind of got baked into these 2 projects. One is that book dedicated, The Case for Commitment in an Age of Infinite Browsing. And the other, is kind of a big part of the message of this documentary, Join or Die, that I co-directed with my sister, Rebecca Davis. But let's start with that kind of first idea that became that book dedicated. The journey began about a decade ago when I noticed something really strange. Throughout my 20s, whenever I or any of my friends or anyone I talked to was asking elders, adults, I'm 34 and I still call them adults sometimes, what do I do with my life? What should we do with our lives? What advice do you have? And, specifically, what should we do with our lives when there's all these big problems in our time? How do we have an impact? What should we do about it? We kept all getting this repeated same response, which was, it's kind of this kind of like totemic phrase. We kept hearing from people, well, I don't know, but you should keep your options open. That was the phrase, keep your options open. It kept being repeated everywhere. It was like a creed, keep your options open. In a way, it's kind of like a punt on the answer of what you should do. I don't really know what you should do, but you should keep your options open when in doubt. I know that you like that high school sweetheart, but, you should keep your options open. I know you're really excited about this cause, but, don't say too much about it. It might close down some options. I know you like this place, but don't dig in too much. You want to keep your options open. You never know where you'll be later. And, I noticed so many of us started internalizing that, and we started giving each other that advice, keep your options open. And, I was wondering how widespread this was. I thought, is this just a privileged thing for people who have a lot of options? But, everyone from all backgrounds of life, even if they didn't have options in one realm of life, they had options, they were keeping their options open in other realms of life that they had a lot of options for. And that was really strange to me, that was kind of like, oh, wow, okay, that's like a creed of our time. And then I happened upon this Polish philosopher, Zygmunt Bauman. And he had this idea called liquid modernity. And I was like, oh man, this is the philosopher of keeping your options open. Liquid modernity, Zygmunt Bauman's idea was the idea that, none of us want to commit to any place or person or institution or community. We want to remain like liquid so that we can adapt to fit any future shape that we must fit later in time. We never know whether it's going to be a round hole or a square hole or whatever. So I shouldn't be a specific type of shape because I should remain liquid so I can fit into any future shape. And where he added to it, he said also in turn the institutions and communities and organizations themselves were remaining like liquid, and they were giving up their loyalties to us. You never know if I don't need these employees anymore. You never know if I don't need these members anymore. You never know if it doesn't really matter that you're citizens of this state anymore. So we have to remain like liquid so we as an org can adapt to fit any future shape, and that's what we live in, liquid modernity. And then I was like, okay, I got this like creed and I got this kind of highfalutin concept of liquid modernity, but then it really hit me emotionally of what was going on in our time when I was, and I'm sure many of you have had this experience, I was browsing Netflix one night, looking for something to watch. I'm sitting on the couch, I scroll through different titles, I read a few reviews, I was like, oh, let me check out the trailer of that, let me check out another trailer, what's its Rotten Tomatoes score? What did Roger Ebert, Roger Ebert was dead by the time the movie came out. Roger Ebert is not here to guide me. Oh, let me start it. I'm not liking these opening scenes. Let me click back. And then I fall asleep and don't watch any given movie. And I go, oh man, that feels awful. This feels like hell. I'm stuck in infinite browsing mode. And that's what was, I have one more metaphor if none of these metaphors have hit. Some people are like, give me another metaphor. We need a fourth. It's like we're escaped the locked room of our childhood, and we're so happy we get to browse all the rooms in the hallway of life, but then we pop into every room, but then we're like, I don't know if I want to settle into any of these rooms, so I might as well sleep in the hallway. So infinite browsing mode, keeping our options open, liquid modernity, living in the hallway. I felt like this is what was happening in our time. And so that was kind of a hint of this question of like what's going on with American public life. But there's a lot of question marks in between that being a phenomenon and what's going on in American public life. And then it'd be, well, so what? Who cares that we're stuck in infinite browsing mode? Well, none of us are happy in infinite browsing mode. None of us are happy in keeping our options open. Keeping our options open seems like a Ponzi scheme because you wake up 5 years later, you're the self that you were keeping your options open for. And you're not that happy that your options have been kept open, and the only skill you've built is keeping your options open. And you look and you say, what should I do now? And you're like, well, I guess I'm really good at keeping my options open. Let me keep my options open for the next 5 years. And you're not solving any of the great problems of our time. You're not having an impact. You're not rebuilding community. You're not rejuvenating institutions. You're not providing hope. And so this isn't the way forward. The advice we've been given by all the adults is totally wrong. All we have, I found this New Yorker article, New Yorker cartoon that captured this really well, which was, it was a grave stone, and it said on the gravestone, he kept his options open. And then this other strange thing happened. Another river joined this river of thought, which was, I looked at who were all the people that were happy and were having an impact. It turned out they were the people who completely ignored this advice of keeping your options open. They were people who made a commitment to a particular thing. They were people who committed to being members of a community. There were people who were local patriots, committed to being members of a place, a neighborhood. There were people who were stewards. They were committing to a specific institution or community. They were artisans. They were people committed to a craft, not just honing the craft, but being part of the craft community. They were companions. They were people who were committed to relationships, the basic form of commitment. They were showing their love for those things, particular things, by working at them for a long time, by taking that brave act of closing doors and clicking out of infinite browsing mode, foregoing options for the sake of their love. And I started calling these people long-haul heroes. Often when we think about heroism, Hollywood heroism, it's usually one big brave moment, There's some horrible guy at the Starbucks and you tell him what you said was wrong or something, storming up the hill, waving your sword, giving the perfect speech at the perfect time. That's how we think of heroism. But what all these kind of long haul heroes were they were the heroes of the day-to-day. They showed their heroism by working day in, day out, year in, year out, 5, 10, 15, 20 years at something. And their heroism looked a lot less like sword waving and a lot more like gardening. It was like the trowel instead of the sword. And this really burrowed deep into my heart. Like, I really believe these people were doing something holy. Like, when you were committed to something for a long time, when you really burrowed in. Like the word dedicate, it has two meanings. One, it means to make something holy, like we dedicated the church or we dedicated the chapel, and it also means to work at something for a long time. She was really dedicated to the project. And I don't think that was a coincidence. You do something holy when you work at something for a long time. You know, infinite browsing felt like hell. The way these people talked about getting into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and being part of the Raleigh-Durham Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu community, or moving to some town and getting really involved in the neighborhood, or Tina starting Creative Mornings. It felt like heaven. You know, they were touching something special. You know, we can't control the length of our days, but they felt like they were controlling the depth of their days. And that felt really special. And so I kind of, took all these ideas and I turned it into a graduation speech and I gave it, and nothing much happened for a year. And then in a weird twist of late stage capitalism, this weird media entity called Goalcast cut my speech in half, stripped out all the particular content to it, made it very abstract. They added what could only be described as a rise and grind beat underneath it. And then they added kind of very generic stock footage over it. And that video was seen by 30 million people. So I guess I was so mad when it was made. I was like, this is awful. And then it turned out to be the thing that let me explore the concept of commitment for another 5 years writing a book. And I got most of the joy of writing it was that I got to explore this idea more. And, just a few things in exploring commitment. It's a really kind of verdant forest to explore, You could start noticing that so many things in American history, or history anywhere, usually has the story of long-haul heroism behind it. So, I think about Rosa Parks. She's often told as a Hollywood hero, like a dragon slaying hero. She had this one big moment where she sat on the bus, and the Montgomery bus boycott happened, and we had the wave of the civil rights movement, and the rest is history. But it turns out, if you read Martin Luther King's memoir, Stride Toward Freedom, about the Montgomery bus boycott, the first chapter of it is incredibly boring and tedious because what he says in the first chapter of the story of the Montgomery bus boycott was that all he does is just name check all of the civic ecosystem that had been built up in Montgomery. So the building that they ran the bus boycott after was the Bricklayers Union that had built up in Montgomery and had enough money to form a building that was the Bricklayers Union building that they could work out of. He himself, Martin Luther King, he talks about, I'm part of all these phone trees, I'm part of all these newsletter committees, I'm doing weddings, I'm doing funerals, I'm building all this trust. There's all these committees in my church. I'm part of committees of all the reverends in Montgomery. There's also a Human Rights Council, there's also a Women's Council, and Rosa Parks herself, she was the secretary, as the official group secretary of the local NAACP for 10 years before she did that. And so the story of this wildfire is actually the story of long haul laying of tinder. In writing the book, I interviewed Evan Wolfson, who's the main lawyer behind the gay marriage decision. 30 years of walking from a law school paper on a crazy idea called gay marriage to 10 years of convincing the gay rights movement to even give him a corner of the movement funding and energy and space to even start working on the marriage project. Then 10 years of getting that first, state of Hawaii and then Massachusetts. And then 10 years of fighting state by state battles. And then eventually when the Obergefell decision came down 30 years after he had written the original paper, he said he finally was able to cry. That's a story of long-haul heroism. We only see the ending. And I also got to explore kind of the fears that come with commitment. Why are we not committing if we're living in the age of keep your options open? What's standing in the way? And I kind of discovered there are these three fears. There's the fear of regret. I'm going to commit to something, but then 20 years from now, I'm going to regret choosing this instead of that. There's the fear of missing out. Because I commit to something, I can't be everywhere with everyone doing everything. And then there's a real millennial one, which is the fear of association, which is in committing to something, it's going to threaten my identity and my sense of self because I'm going to have to take in all the messiness of the larger thing that I'm committing to. I'm going to have to stand by the organization that I'm committing to. I'm going to stand by the person that I'm in a relationship with. I'm going to be accountable to them. I'm going to, be of a place, and people have all these thoughts about what that place means, and I'm going to have to kind of be part of that. And I think those three fears were standing in the way. And then I tried to, I talked to a bunch of long haul heroes, and I'm like, how do you overcome these fears? And it turns out there are really interesting ways to overcome these fears. So, different mindset shifts. So, and there's a gift at the other end of each of these fears. So, fear of regret, you're scared that you 20 years from now will regret what you chose among the choices. But it turns out when you make a commitment, that changes who you are and changes the person that eventually has the capability of looking back and wondering whether you should have made that decision. So you actually are converted into being the person who made that commitment, and it rewires the constellation of meaning in your life by the act of making the commitment. And then it becomes very hard to regret the choice you made, because so much of you becomes part of the thing that you made. You move to Texas and you become a Texan. You meet a bunch of people in Texas. You learn about the history of Texas. You start wearing a cowboy hat or whatever it is. And then you look back 20 years ago, and the material in which you look back on your life is Texan. So it's some people still regret things, but it's much less likely than you think you will. Okay, then the fear of missing out. What's the mind shift there? Well, we're scared of, by committing to going to the mending circle every Thursday, what if something cool comes up on a Thursday and I committed to going to the mending circle? So yes, you're going to miss out on some things if you commit to something. But if this is the mindset shift a bunch of these people had, they said, well, if I don't commit to things, I'm also going to miss out on a bunch of things. So it's a wash. And in fact, many of the novel things that are like the most exciting, most cool, the equivalent of skydiving, are actually the feelings you have at the end of a long commitment. Whatever razzle-dazzle thing you're missing is nothing compared to the feeling of taking an idea from a Google Doc to a building. It's nothing compared to having a bunch of friends that you've been through have a bunch of war stories with. It's nothing compared to, watching the neighborhood garden that you wanted to start in your neighborhood come to fruition. Those are the novelties you're missing out on if you never commit. And then finally, this is fear of association. This is really interesting. So many people felt like, okay, I have a rigid, static, almost platonic self. And anytime I attach to a cause or a craft or a community or a place or a person, I have to assess, does that thing out there fit with the magic me that's like, I have to find. And I'm always wondering, is this me? Is this me? Is this me? Is this me? And if maybe it's not me, maybe part of it isn't me. Maybe I think this part's part of me, but that part's not part of me. But what so many of these long haul heroes told me is they said, that's not the way I think about myself. There's this Bob Dylan line. He says, he was asked by an interviewer, he said, did you leave Minnesota to go find yourself? And he goes, nobody finds themselves, they make themselves. And the material in which we make ourselves are our commitments and relationships. So there is no, there's some authenticity out there. There's some senses you have in your soul if something fits you, but it's not rigid and full and complete. What makes it feel more complete? It's not like fitting Tetris pieces together. It's like growing a garden of who you are. It's the commitments themselves. And so they said, I no longer fear the fear of association because that is the stuff that makes me who I am. And all of this is hard. It's hard to convert into a commitment. It's hard to give up immediate novelties for the great novelties there. It's hard to deal with the awkwardness of all the people you have to deal with when committing to something. But on the other side are prizes. When you overcome the fear of regret, you have a real sense of purpose. When you overcome the fear of missing out, you have the novelty of depth, like the real deep joys of depth. And then when you overcome the fear of association, when you go through the desert of community building where it's awkward on the first day and you say, how's the weather? Do you have any siblings? You come out the other end and you have community and friends where it's not awkward anymore. And along the way, you had the balm of mercy, willingness to enter into the chaos of others, willingness to come up with solutions to the awkward contradictions of your group. come through and you end up with a lot of friends. And so at the other end of commitments and the other end of these fears are, purpose and depth and community and joy and impact. And that's, what I was trying to do. I wanted people to make that jump. There's no blueprint for solving the great big problems of our time. We just need, my theory is basically we just need a lot of people working on it. We need a lot of people falling in love with different corners of the world and loving them into being better. And, Wendell Berry, the great Kentucky philosopher, anyone know Wendell Berry, the great farmer philosopher? He has this wonderful phrase. He says, we live in an age where so many things have fallen apart. And all we can do is we can take one thing that should be with another thing and put it together. And then he has this great phrase. Two things, not all things. Two things, not all things. And, that's what I started thinking about commitment. We can't solve all the problems in the world, but if we feel we are to be connected with something and put a little things together, like Tina put all you together this morning, and the whole team, that's what we could do. Two things, not all things. And it adds up. If all of us are doing two things, not all things, it quickly becomes all things. But then I ran into this problem, which was that, I kept going on podcasts talking about commitment, and I kept getting asked this question. So that was my first insight, commitment's important. But I ran into this problem. Not that profound, but, it's taken my life. I kept going on podcasts. I kept getting asked this question. Oh, Pete, we got Pete on here. He's the commitment guy. We're going to talk about commitment to our health regimen or commitment to working out. I'm like, look at me. I am not knowledgeable about commitment to a health regimen or commitment to working out. And, other ones were like, I saw your speech, Pete, and I decided this year I'm committed to me or something, or I'm committed to naps or something. And I go, no, that's not what I'm talking about at all. Like, that might be a nice thing. That might be someone else, but I'm not talking about that. So I was like, oh gosh, I didn't hit it. It's not commitment. That's not the exact thing. And people said, oh, this is a guy who wants no one to quit things. And I go, oh, no, I'm not against quitting. I'm against browsing infinitely. It's okay to quit. The knowledge that you can quit is what lowers the stakes that allows you to make a commitment and let the natural forces of commitment take over and make you not want to quit. And so I was like, okay, something's missing here. And there was also this thing missing, which is I said, like, commitment's good. People make commitments and it seems like good things happen, but what's the mystery box right here? Big question mark. And so I said, okay, something's missing here. And then I ran into the story of Wendell Berry's bucket, and it kind of answered the question. So Wendell Berry has this parable of the bucket. He says there's this old bucket on his farm, his grandpa's farm. It's always kind of like these pastoral stories from Wendell Berry. On my grandpa's farm, there's an old bucket. And the bucket was behind the barn, and it was on a rusty nail, and everyone forgot about it. And he checked out the bucket, and he noticed that over time, that bucket had gathered feathers, and some mice crawled into the bucket, and leaves fell in the bucket, and rain fell in the bucket, and little bugs climbed through the bucket, and a bird made its nest in the bucket, but then the bird left, and the eggs looked in the bucket. And by the time he looked into the bucket 10 years after the bucket was there and undisturbed, he noticed it was the most rich soil ever inside of the bucket. What that bucket had done is it had created culture. It had been cultivated. And why was it able to be cultivated? Because that bucket had stayed there and had been steady and solid and committed to being on that nail and holding all those things. And what Wendell Berry is talking about in that parable is that when we commit to a community of people and it's relatively stable, it's not feathers and eggs and bugs, it's inside jokes and little songs that you make, and ways you start dressing, and ways you solve problems, and memories of a big fight you had and healed, and memories of a big challenge you all faced and solved and overcame, and little rules of thumb, and all of that. And out of that, out of a committed community, comes culture. What commitment enables is it enables cultivation. That is the magic sauce in why does commitment lead to good things. Cultivation is not just music and food. Culture is not just music and food. Culture is the accrual of all of the experiential knowledge of the life of the community imprinted on the life of the community. And that's what's going on out there. But what's going on in here in each of all the members of the cultivation process is it's not only that cultivation is growing and you can go to a place that's really well cultivated and see this is awesome. It's also cultivating inside of each of them to make them feel part of this thing, make them weave their own stories into the story of this thing. And that was very revealing for me because it kind of solved this question of why does it seem like no big idea that it comes along to solve, like silver bullet that comes along to solve public problems, ever works. Because you check in on a TED Talk 10 years later, and it turns out that the big idea that they talked about that was going to save everything, microfinance or something, it turns out 10 years later, you find out it's not that it was a sham, it's just that, well, it worked in one place, it didn't work in another place. Well, it only works if everyone has buy-in. Oh, well, it only works if it's part of an ecosystem of other ideas that all work together. And there are some places that don't have it and they seem to have solved the problems, and there's some places that do have it and don't seem to have solved the problems. And so it turns out like big ideas and silver bullets don't solve things. And then it makes you wonder, well, why do some things still work? Why are there some schools that have turned around? Why are there some places that have turned around? Why are there some communities that have worked? Well, they're well cultivated. There were people who were committed, and they allowed that magic process of the accrual of experiential knowledge in a stable bucket to grow, and it's awesome. And the places that aren't working, it's usually because they're not well cultivated. Usually maybe the people weren't committed, maybe they just wanted it to happen quickly, maybe they let a culture die because no one was stewarding it or they were holding to it too rigidly and so people didn't feel an ownedness over it. And so that kind of became the second big idea, which is the reason we like commitment is commitment leads to cultivation, and cultivation leads to the happiness and the impact and the joy. And so kind of to close out, that led to this kind of movie, Join or Die, partially, that I've made with my sister, Rebecca Davis, which is, okay, if you really care about the magic of cultivation, what is the thing that leads to those commitments and that cultivation? And what we found, I'll give away you've already heard the ending, but I'll give away how we got there. Turns out there's this, what we put forth is that it's clubs. It's associational life. Turns out there's this guy, Robert Putnam, who wrote this book, Bowling Alone, and we tell the story of Bowling Alone, which is about the decline of community in America and club life in America over the last 50 years. We talk about that in the movie, but it turns out there's a prequel to Bowling Alone, which was his own long-haul journey. So this political scientist, Robert Putnam, he goes to Italy, and for 20 years, he studies why some regional governments in Italy work well, and some regional governments in Italy don't work well. Kind of like one of these questions I'm obsessed with, what makes kind of public life work? And he runs all the variables. Is it the economy? Is it education? Is it the presence of religion? Is it the stability of the staff? Is it, how many political parties there are? Is it the design of the Constitution? And what he finds is the only thing that correlates with government success in a really strong way is the amount of bocce clubs and the amount of choral societies and the amount of local newspaper readerships. And qualitatively, he's like, well, the place where the government's working, they have these grand plazas where everyone's like sipping coffee and talking to each other and dancing in the street. And he goes, has a 91% correlation. And he's like, and he told me, social scientists never get a 91% correlation. And correlation does not equal causation, so he needs to find a causal mechanism. And what he rediscovers is this idea he calls social capital, which is the spirit of kind of the amount of social networks, the density of the social networks of the place, the amount of associational life, the amount of people that trust their neighbors, the amount of people that are having dinner parties, things like this. And how I interpret that is that what he's talking about with social capital is the relationships themselves and the associations that are the vessel for those relationships are the vessel for the cultivation. They are the buckets. When you have a relationship and you have a committed relationship over the long haul, culture is created, people are weaved together, they're weaved together into their institutions, and experiential knowledge is accrued, and good things happen, and people feel happy. And so it's kind of like we just had Passover, and there's this thing called Had Gadya, where they're like, the cat ate the mouse and the dog ate the cat, and it gets violent, like the person killed the dog or something. But does anyone know Had Gadya? What? The cat eats the goat. I'm half Jewish, so I'm not as good at the songs, and it's kind of like that. It's like, what creates the cultivation? Well, it's the commitments, and what creates the commitments? Well, they're commitments to relationships, and what creates the relationships? Well, it's associational. If you want to create relationships at a large scale, it's associational life. It's the clubs, and Bob came back to America, found out we're having a giant decline in clubs. There's also a giant decline in commitment. There's a giant decline in cultivation and culture, and so the message of the movie is, we need to become a nation of joiners again. And we need to do what needs to be done to create the conditions to facilitate that joining. So I'll end here. What this all comes down to is we got to be brave, and we got to make that jump to make a commitment and start that cultivation process and join one of these clubs. This whole thing was just propaganda for joining Creative Mornings clubs, which I wanted for Tina. And so I'll end with this very short Wendell Berry poem about hope in making that choice. It's called February 2nd, 1968. It's very resonant to what's going on today. Here it is. In the dark of the moon, in flying snow, in the dead of winter, war spreading, families dying, the world in danger, I walk the rocky hillside sowing clover. I walk the rocky hillside sowing clover. We feel like there's a rocky hillside out there, and what we got to do is sow some clover, and who knows what it'll be like in 40, 50 years. Thanks, everyone.